Blood and authority were the dual fixations that shaped Harry VIII's reign. As his swollen body decayed inwardly during the last cold days of the year 1547, England's most infamous monarch confronted his own mortality with the same merciless strategy that had led him to execute 2 wives and numerous adversaries. Court members whispered, "The lion is dying," behind closed doors, yet his claws stayed sharp until his final breath. This horrifying end was set in motion many years earlier when he was a striking and athletic prince, celebrated throughout Europe for his energy and charisma. How did this shining figure of the Renaissance era become the terrifying despot, struggling for air in the dimly lit rooms of Whitehall Palace? The explanation lies not only in his notorious marriages, but also in a chain of health disasters that warped his physical and mental state beyond all recognition. By January of 1547, Harry was scarcely identifiable as the man who had once competed in jousts against the finest knights of Christendom. His body had turned into a battleground of ailments. His legs were covered with festering sores, releasing such a dreadful stench that those around him often fought the urge to vomit. The king now depended on mechanical aids to carry his immense weight, which some records indicate had nearly reached 400 pounds. His once attractive face was now swollen and misshapen, with eyes sunken deeply beneath sickly yellow flesh. The royal doctors had long exhausted their limited remedies, unable to relieve his suffering. Attempts such as bloodletting, herbal mixtures, and prayers all failed to relieve the suffering of their ruler. The range of illnesses affecting him has led most modern scholars to conclude that Harry endured type 2 diabetes, gout, and possibly osteomyelitis, a painful infection of the bone that would account for the persistent agony in his legs. Even more alarming was the decline of the king's mental state. His notorious temper had transformed into sudden bouts of fury, mixed with intervals of bewildered sluggishness. Despite the approach of death, the struggles over succession dominated the royal court. Harry's third spouse, Jane Somers, had finally given him a male offspring, the delicate 9-year-old Edward, yet influential groups were already maneuvering to gain control over the boy after the king's passing. The conservative Catholic faction, headed by Thomas Howard, clashed with the reformist Protestants, led by Edward Somers, the young prince's uncle. Harry, suspicious until the very end, remained very aware of these threats, continuing to sign death warrants even while barely able to grasp a pen. The king's rapid health decline was kept as one of the most tightly held secrets throughout the kingdom. Official announcements still declared Harry to be robust and vigorous, while the truth painted a starkly different picture. Those allowed into the royal sick chamber faced a grim spectacle. The enormous royal bed draped with somber fabrics, the sickly sweet stench of decay only faintly hidden by the burning of incense. At the core stood the towering figure of a man who once embodied the strength of England itself. The palace staff murmured about hearing the king's anguished cries echo through the stone halls of Whitehall. Harry's leg ulcers caused him intense agony so severe that even the slightest movement could provoke spasms of pain. His doctors resorted to poultices made from everything from boiled onions to ground human skull fragments, desperate treatments that only worsened his misery. A more effective method proved to be the generous use of opium, which eased the king's suffering but further clouded his already failing mind. The mental anguish was as profound as the physical torment. Once the most dreaded figure in England, whose commands meant life or death, Harry now found himself powerless against the betrayal of his own body. Legal documents reveal increasingly unstable conduct and near delirium when he would ramble about ghosts of executed adversaries or call out for wives long deceased. During occasional moments of clarity, the king obsessively examined his will, determined to shape the future of his lineage even after his passing. Observers grew concerned over Harry's wavering religious stance in these final days. Having broken from Rome to declare himself head of the Church of England, he appeared haunted by spiritual uncertainty. One day he demanded Catholic rites, only to reaffirm Protestant beliefs the next. Next, his personal chaplain documented how the king would awake in terror from terrifying dreams, stating he saw the faces of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and other victims of his rule standing silently at the foot of his bed, judging him without a word. The king's approaching death caused a hazardous power void that his courtiers hurried to occupy. The Privy Council split into rival groups, each striving to gain favorable positions for the future regency. Thomas Howard, who had endured decades of court scheming, found himself outplayed by the Protestant faction. In a final act demonstrating Harry's relentless cruelty, Howard was condemned to death for treason under the authority of the dying king, but he eventually escaped execution since Harry died before the sentence could be fulfilled. January 27, 1547, signaled the start of Harry's ultimate decline. Witnesses described the king suffering a seizure so severe that attendants had to hold him firmly to avoid harm. After this passed, Harry struggled with speech and had partial paralysis on his right side, clear signs that modern doctors would recognize as a severe stroke. The court physicians, fully aware that failing to keep the king alive might lead to their own disgrace or death, worked desperately to save him. They used heated irons on his skin and forced unpleasant medicines down his throat. During this critical time, entry to the royal bedchamber was tightly controlled and limited. Under the control of Harry's most trusted advisor, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, this secrecy had a practical reason beyond mere respect. News of the king's approaching death could spark premature struggles for power or even provoke foreign invasions. Cranmer made sure that only the absolutely necessary attendants were allowed nearby, and each was bound by a strict oath to remain completely silent about the monarch's condition. Even Queen Catherine Parr, Harry's sixth and surviving wife, was kept away during certain critical moments. The king slipped in and out of awareness as January turned into February. During brief moments of clarity, Harry reportedly voiced increasing fear about his forthcoming judgment before God. The very man who had ordered the execution of 2 wives, numerous nobles, and thousands of common people now confronted his own mortality with mounting anxiety. According to a diary kept by one attendant, the king was heard softly mumbling prayers and asking for forgiveness while asleep. This was a striking difference from the ruthless ruler who had transformed England's religious scene through sheer determination. Court documents revealed the extraordinary steps taken to uphold Harry's remaining dignity in his last days. As his bodily functions deteriorated, groups of servants labored in shifts to handle the unpleasant duties of cleaning and repositioning his heavy royal body. The ulcers on his legs had become so severe that bone could reportedly be seen through the deadened skin, and the odor was overwhelming. The odor became so overpowering that scented handkerchiefs turned into necessary items for anyone entering the royal chamber. Windows were thrown wide open despite the cold of winter each time the king lost consciousness. By the 27th of February, even the elaborate charade that the king might regain health was no longer upheld among court members. Archbishop Cranmer was urgently called to the royal bedside as Harry's breathing grew increasingly difficult. According to contemporary reports, the king, unable to speak, was asked to squeeze Cranmer's hand if he trusted in Christ rather than the religious rites he had once cherished. Harry reportedly squeezed with his remaining strength before slipping into his last coma, a touching detail often mentioned by Protestant historians as proof of a deathbed conversion. The king passed away before dawn on the 28th of January, 1547. Even in death, Harry's imposing physical presence filled the royal chamber, his body a grotesque symbol of excess and suffering. The official cause of death was simply recorded as natural decline, though modern medical study suggests a deadly combination of heart failure, infections from wounds, and complications likely linked to type 2 diabetes. More astonishing than the passing itself was the remarkable silence that followed, as the Privy Council concealed the news for 3 entire days while securing power around young Edward VI. This delay turned out to be significant. A smooth transfer of authority was essential while Harry's body lay cooling in his chamber. Edward Somers, Earl of Hertford, and uncle to the new ruler, acted with ruthless precision to seize power. Secret discussions took place, key strongholds were secured, and potential contenders were neutralized before Harry's death was publicly announced on the 31st of January. When the bells of London finally tolled to mark the passing of the monarch, Edward Somers had already been appointed Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, effectively governing England on behalf of his nephew. The handling of Harry's remains presented distinct difficulties that shed light on both Tudor funeral traditions and the king's physical state at the time of his death. Court documents reveal that the royal body began to decay rapidly, most likely due to severe infections present before death. The embalmer hurriedly prepared the corpse by removing internal organs and filling the cavities with aromatic herbs and preservatives. Even these seasoned specialists were reportedly taken aback by the condition of Harry's internal organs, especially his diseased liver and swollen heart. Harry's coffin needed special craftsmanship to fit his extraordinary size, reportedly nearly double the width of a typical noble's casket. The immense weight required a strengthened bier and extra bearers during the lying in state at Whitehall. Witnesses noted that the lead-lined coffin actually cracked due to the pressure from gases accumulating inside. A decaying body leaking fluids onto the chapel floor created a grim detail that was quickly concealed, yet reports indicate that dogs licked the spills, adding a disturbing final insult to a king who valued grandeur above all. The funeral procession to Windsor Castle on the 16th of February offered the Tudor regime one last chance to flaunt Harry's authority even after his death. Black-draped horses dragged the immense coffin through streets packed with mourners, while statues showed the king as he looked in his prime, not the swollen figure he had become. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, Harry was interred next to Jane Somers, the only wife to bear him a son and heir, and the sole one who escaped the fall from royal favor because she died from childbirth complications before Harry's. Affections could turn away. The harsh reality of Harry's decaying corpse stood in stark contrast to the glorified image already being crafted about his rule. Court artists such as Hans Hollein had designed the lasting portrayal of Harry as a broad-shouldered symbol of masculine strength, feet firmly planted, hands on hips, staring boldly at the audience. This deliberate propaganda barely resembled the disease-ridden body now buried beneath Windsor's stone floor, yet it would become the iconic representation of Harry VIII in the public imagination for many centuries. Harry's final will disclosed his last efforts to secure his legacy. To exert influence over the future even after death, the 30-page document carefully detailed the line of succession, first to Edward, then to Mary, daughter of his first spouse, Catherine of Aragon, and finally to Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. This clear order of inheritance, despite being briefly interrupted by the 9-day rule of Lady Jane Grey, would ultimately be followed just as Harry had laid out. The king's posthumous control over England extended through all three of his children, each ruling as Tudor monarchs, until the dynasty concluded with Elizabeth I's passing in 1603. More immediately crucial were the power structures Harry arranged for Edward's minority. The king established a regency council of 16 men designed to govern jointly until Edward turned 18. This balanced plan reflected Harry's wariness of any single noble obtaining excessive control over his son. However, this careful design was soon overturned, as Edward Somers outmaneuvered his fellow councillors to become Lord Protector within mere days of Harry's death. The rapid manner in which Harry's intentions were overturned exposed the limits of a king's authority once death had silenced his formidable presence. Meanwhile, the medical story of Harry's final days continues to captivate historians and doctors alike. His symptoms have been retrospectively interpreted as signs of numerous ailments, ranging from syphilis to scurvy. But the most convincing evidence points to type 2 diabetes, complicated by other conditions. Chronic osteomyelitis forced the king's medical team to resort to increasingly desperate remedies. Treatments ranged from placing live pigeons cut in half directly on his festering sores to administering experimental mixtures that included gold and ground precious gems. These costly, yet ineffective cures highlight not only the limitations of Tudor-era medicine, but also the extraordinary efforts made for a patient of Harry's importance. Perhaps the most touching discoveries were personal belongings, found in the king's chambers after his passing. Alongside the expected royal symbols such as jeweled daggers, official seals, and diplomatic letters, servants uncovered a small locked box filled with more intimate items: a miniature portrait of Jane Somers, a lock of hair believed to belong to his Mother Elizabeth of York, and a child's handwritten prayer book that may have once belonged to Elizabeth before her mother's execution. These heartfelt details provide insight into the man behind the fearsome image, indicating that despite his physical and mental decline, Harry retained some attachment to family ties and personal memories. The king's death triggered immediate shifts in political power that would influence England for many years. Conservative Catholic factions that had held sway during Harry's final days quickly lost their control when Edward Somers established a firmly Protestant regency. Archbishop Cranmer, who had administered the last rites to the dying king, now intensified religious reforms at an accelerated pace. This marked a decisive change in the kingdom's religious landscape, setting the course for future transformations under the new leadership. Harry had taken a more careful approach, and the first English edition of the Book of Common Prayer was released just 2 years after Harry's passing, pushing England further towards Protestant ideals than the king himself had ever planned. Harry's intricate religious stance, having separated from Rome but holding on to many Catholic traditions, left a legacy that was open to interpretation, allowing both Protestant and Catholic groups to claim him as their own. Protestant advocates highlighted his refusal of papal control, while Catholics pointed to his support for transubstantiation and resistance to Lutheran beliefs. This theological uncertainty sparked religious strife throughout the reigns of all 3 of his children as England swung between extreme Protestantism under Edward, a Catholic revival under Mary, and eventually the moderate path set by Elizabeth. The king's death also marked a pivotal moment in Tudor propaganda. Since Harry had been portrayed as England's protector against foreign enemies and papal oppression, royal propagandists now faced the task of passing this image on to a 9-year-old boy. Paintings of young Edward VI were designed to mirror his father's iconic pose, showing the boy with the same wide-legged stance and bold expression seen in Harry's legendary portraits. Court rituals underlined continuity, with nobles expected to show the same respect to Edward's vacant throne as they had to his father's. Beyond the political arena, where they had revealed his father's influence, Harry's passing echoed throughout everyday life in England. For nearly 4 decades, he had stood as the symbol of royal power. His character and desires directly influenced governance, even at the local level. His demise left a void not only in politics, but also in the collective mindset. Records from parishes in early 1547 show widespread unease about what lay ahead, with many noting prophetic dreams, unusual celestial signs, and even reports of ghostly appearances. For a people deeply entwined with religious symbolism, the death of such a commanding monarch carried a sense of apocalyptic significance. Reactions abroad to Harry's death highlighted the delicate position England held within Europe at the time. The French envoy shared that King Francis II sincerely grieved for his dear brother from England, despite their many past disputes. Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, assessed the situation more strategically, pondering whether England, now under a young ruler, might be vulnerable to invasion or shifting alliances. Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Harry some 10 years prior, is said to have held a mass for the king's soul as a diplomatic act that recognized Harry's importance while reasserting the Catholic claim over his spiritual fate. The very place where Harry breathed his last, his private quarters at Whitehall Palace, soon took on a profound significance. The historical importance became clear almost instantly as courtiers expressed hesitation to enter the chambers, where the king endured his final torment. Rumors spread about strange noises and unexplained cold spots, which only heightened superstitious anxiety. Young Edward V, who was 6 years old at the time, reportedly refused to use his late father's bed, demanding that new quarters be made ready. This psychological consequence highlights the traumatic effect of Harry's death on those who had closely observed his decline, many of whom had dedicated themselves to anticipating and fulfilling his often unpredictable wishes. Harry's medical case stands as one of the most thoroughly documented royal deaths in history, offering crucial insights into Tudor medical practices. His doctors maintained meticulous notes on the treatments given during his last months, and these records have survived because they were kept as proof that every possible effort had been made to save the monarch. The documents show a blend of ancient Galenic medicine and advancing Renaissance treatments, including hot cupping to extract harmful humors, herbal remedies drawn from classical sources, and primitive forms of hydrotherapy. The inability of these approaches to ease his suffering underlines the challenges even the era's most skilled healers faced. The king's preoccupation with his legacy extended to detailed instructions for his final resting place, a grandiose monument intended to overshadow all other royal tombs in England. Harry commissioned magnificent plans featuring 40 life-sized bronze statues, aiming to secure a posthumous image as grand as his reign. Monuments and a towering central edifice crowned with a horse-mounted sculpture of himself. This extravagant design revealed both his pride and his concern about how future generations would remember him. Interestingly, the enormous undertaking was never completed because of monetary limitations, and the intended bronze statues were eventually melted down during the English Civil War, an event that surely would have angered the image-conscious monarch. Following Harry's death, there was a swift movement among court members either to cling to or distance themselves from his reputation. Those who had lost favor during his last years emerged from obscurity, while others who had benefited from his support hurried to form new alliances. The archives hold touching letters from royal servants who suddenly found themselves without roles after many years of serving the king's personal wishes. For numerous individuals, adaptation was out of reach, as the abilities needed to handle Harry's unpredictable temperament had little use in Edward Summer's more controlled court. Some former favorites took their own lives in the months after the king passed away, unable to cope with the sudden changes in power. Perhaps most importantly, Harry's passing marked the start of a vital shift in English leadership, from the domination of an authoritarian ruler whose personal desires shaped policy to more cooperative arrangements of governance shared between the monarchy and the aristocracy. During Edward's reign as Lord Protector, Seymour did not possess Harry's formidable personal influence and depended much more on the approval of the council. Although this change was momentarily reversed during Mary's reign, it set important foundations for limiting royal authority. These developments continued under Elizabeth and eventually played a key role in England's distinctive constitutional progress. Paradoxically, Harry's passing weakened the very institution of absolute monarchy that he had devoted his life to reinforcing. The king's last illness has been subject to extensive medical analysis, with each generation of doctors interpreting his symptoms through the lens of contemporary knowledge. Victorian physicians, shaped by their moral views on disease, often identified syphilis as the probable cause, seeing Harry's condition as punishment for his sexual indulgences. In the early 20th century, experts shifted their attention to metabolic illnesses, proposing gout and diabetes as main factors. More recent medical historians have suggested more intricate diagnoses such as Mallaud syndrome, a rare hereditary disorder that could explain both his physical decline and changes in his mental state, as well as chronic traumatic encephalopathy caused by numerous jousting injuries sustained during his youth. The handling of Harry's personal belongings offers a fascinating insight into Tudor-era customs concerning death and memory. Records from the royal court reveal that items touched by the king in his final days received special veneration and care. Some items were preserved almost as relics, even though the official Protestant stance rejected such customs. His last set of nightclothes, stained with bodily fluids, was ceremoniously burned under Cranmer's oversight, blending practical hygiene with symbolic meaning. More precious possessions, including his large array of astronomical tools and maps, were meticulously recorded before being dispersed according to his testament or kept for Edward's instruction. Harry's passing left his surviving wives and children in delicate situations, demanding careful management of court dynamics. Catherine Parr, his widow, publicly observed a respectful mourning period, while secretly quickly moving to wed her true love, Thomas Howard, a marriage she had postponed during Harry's life. The 9-year-old Edward, now king in title but heavily dominated by his Seymour uncles, noted his father's death with unsettling detachment in his journal, stating the emperor's ambassador was ordered to return home on the 4th of January upon the death of the king my father, whose soul God pardon. This formal, unemotional record reveals their distant personal bond. Meanwhile, Harry's daughters confronted their own difficulties under the new reign. Mary, at 31, remained a devoted Catholic, growing increasingly estranged by Edward's Protestant changes. Elizabeth, only 13, had to handle court life with extraordinary caution, her status made precarious due to her mother's background. The execution and ongoing doubts about her legitimacy haunted both princesses, who would one day ascend to the throne Harry had promised them. However, their journey was perilous. Mary barely escaped execution during Wyatt's rebellion, and Elizabeth endured imprisonment in the Tower throughout her sister's reign. The descriptions of Harry's final moments reveal an intense isolation experienced by even the most powerful ruler at the time of death. Although surrounded by doctors, attendants, and courtiers, contemporary reports indicate that Harry faced his last hours in profound solitude, set apart by both his royal stature and the deeply personal nature of dying. Archbishop Cranmer's attempts to provide spiritual comfort reportedly elicited little reaction beyond a final grasp of the hand. The king, who had demanded total obedience throughout his domain, ultimately traveled alone on the final journey. This serves as a touching reminder of how death equalizes all. The year that followed Harry's passing showed just how much his personality had shaped English governance. Administrative documents revealed a pile of decisions awaiting his direct attention, including many matters subordinates could have handled but had been deferred due to a culture of extreme respect. During Edward's regency, government operations had to be reorganized to operate without the king's personal input. Though initially disordered, this change was essential for the realm's continued function. The governance of institutions was ultimately reinforced by creating bureaucratic structures capable of functioning without the monarch's direct involvement. Harry's ornate funeral procession marked his final appearance within England's public arena of authority. Contemporary descriptions recount horses cloaked in black velvet, heralds carrying ceremonial arms, and a life-sized wax figure of the king adorned in full ceremonial dress resting atop his coffin. This artificial representation stood in for the decaying natural body concealed beneath. The procession traveled from London to Windsor over several days, permitting thousands of citizens to observe this last display of Tudor sovereignty. The meticulous arrangement revealed profound concern about the political shift, employing ritual to emphasize that although the king might pass away, the monarchy would continue. Physicians at court who failed to save the king faced uncertain futures after his death. Medical documents indicate some swiftly found roles within other noble households, while others endured professional isolation due to their connection with Harry's unsuccessful care. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who courageously informed Harry of his imminent death when others were reluctant to speak, transformed this act of bravery into ongoing royal employment under Edward V. The king's apothecaries were subject to intense examination, with inventories of medicines given during Harry's final sickness, scrutinized for signs of neglect or possibly intentional wrongdoing. The scientific investigation of Harry's remains, carried out during vault renovations in the 1800s, offered fascinating insights into his physical state at the time of his passing. Workers reported discovering a massive skeleton matching Harry's well-known height, along with signs of severe joint degeneration, especially in the legs. Contemporary forensic analysis combined with historical medical documents indicates that Harry might have weighed close to 400 pounds when he died, with a waist circumference greater than 50 inches. This extreme obesity, coupled with poor blood circulation in his legs and the open wounds described in period accounts, would have created perfect conditions for the infection that likely played a role in his demise. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Harry's final days is what they reveal about the limits of power. This king, who transformed the religious landscape of England, executed queens and nobles without hesitation, and established a navy that would eventually dominate the seas, found himself completely powerless against the decline of his own body. Court records depict moments of Harry angrily confronting his doctors, insisting they restore his health through the sheer authority of royal command. This unsuccessful resistance to the realities of biology highlights the core contradiction of absolute monarchy. The unavoidable weakness of even the most influential human being when faced with sickness, decay, and death. The uncertain religious circumstances around Harry's death further opened a space for reflection. In the battle between competing stories that supported different political goals, Protestant historians focused on the king's final moments, highlighting a clear embrace of evangelical beliefs. Meanwhile, Catholic authors outside England portrayed him as a ruler plagued by remorse over his rupture with Rome. However, the facts indicate that Harry sustained his usual religious stance until the very end. He considered himself the ultimate authority of the English Church, but rejected essential Protestant teachings. This intricate theological position, largely Catholic in its rituals, yet dismissing papal control, mirrored the king's lifelong habit of adapting institutions to suit his personal desires, rather than complying with outside expectations. The economic fallout from Harry's death reached well beyond the royal court. Financial documents reveal that the newly established Regency government inherited a treasury in severe deficit, along with a currency that had lost value considerably. These issues stemmed from Harry's costly foreign military campaigns and his extravagant personal expenditures. Some analyses estimate that during his reign, Harry spent what would equal $200 million in today's currency purely on building palaces. Facing this financial turmoil, Edward Somers was compelled to uphold Harry's divisive approach of selling church lands, accelerating one of the largest shifts in land ownership in English history. The financial shockwaves from Harry's excessive spending fueled inflation and social tensions throughout the reigns of his children. His physical deterioration became a powerful symbol for those who lived at the time. Many saw the king's body as a representation of the nation itself. Just as medieval political thought described the monarch as the head of the body politic, Tudor writers understood Harry's deteriorating flesh as a sign of a more profound decay within the kingdom. Sermons that have survived from the year 1547 reveal preachers explicitly comparing the king's rotting legs to the moral decline in English society. This symbolic interpretation gained political significance during Edward's rule because reformers claimed that just as Harry's body needed drastic treatment, England's religious customs required purification as well. The last days of Harry VIII mark a distinct point where medieval and early modern ideas about kingship intersected. On one side, the intricate death ceremonies focused on correct burial, and concerns about succession echoed ancient royal death customs going back many centuries. On the other side, the thorough medical notes, legal exactness of Harry's will, and steady government institutions demonstrated newer methods of state authority. Therefore, Harry died between two periods. He was the final English monarch to exercise truly medieval power, but also a ruler who initiated the bureaucratic system that shaped future leadership. What makes Harry VIII's passing so fascinating is not only the terrible physical suffering or its political impact, but also the way it symbolizes a transition in governance and society. The story reveals profound truths about the human experience itself. The king who ruled his time through sheer personality strength ended his life confronting the same boundaries that affect even the most ordinary people. Reports from that era indicate that Harry went through moments of deep existential fear during his final days, facing judgment not as a ruler, but simply as a mortal man. The Archbishop of Canterbury is said to have reminded him, when administering last rites, "You are about to enter a place where titles hold no value and no worldly power can provide safety." In that ultimate state of human fragility, perhaps England's most notorious ruler found a connection with his people, that he never managed to establish during his lifetime.